Thank you so much for joining us today. I wondered if we might kick off our conversation by asking you each to introduce yourselves.
Okay, so I'm Mark Hailwood. I'm a lecturer in history at the University of Bristol. My research focuses on the 16th and 17th centuries, and in particular on the everyday lives of ordinary men and women. And the two main topics I've explored within that are the history of drinking and the history of work.
Okay. I'm Laura Sangha. I'm a senior lecturer in history, again, at the University of Exeter. And I am a historian of religious cultures in 16th and 17th century England. So I'm interested in theology and ideas and belief, but particularly in how that has an impact on people's lives. How do changing religious ideas make a difference to them in their local communities and in their parishes? So that's what I'm going to focus on.
Thank you. So, I mean, one of the things that ties both of your work together, and we're lucky today that we don't have to have a shared screen because you're both isolated, in the same room. And one of the things that also ties your research work together is this interest in, I guess, popular belief, popular ways of kind of living, of communal existence in places like alehouses. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you would approach that when we're talking about 16th and 17th century individuals, what this idea of popular means and how we might begin to recover it.
Yes, a very, very vexed historiographical question there, the definition of popular. I mean, for me as a religious historian, very often I use it as a kind of synonym for the laity. So beyond the church, the kind of more ordinary folk that are sat in the pew, what is it that they're thinking or doing, or where are they coming from? So when I'm thinking about the popular, very often that's who I have in mind. And then I guess I'm particularly interested, therefore, in their communal practices. So when they do get together in the church, what is it that they're doing? What are they saying? What might that mean to them? What do they see around them? How do these things work? And then once they take that outside of the church, what goes with them? So is it just, in one ear and out the other, or does it actually in some way shape what happens to them once they've left that church building? So that's how it works for me, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in trying to access the history of basically groups that don't show up in the records in any straightforward way would probably be one way, a perverse way of kind of thinking about what I spend most of my time doing. I mean, as a historian of the everyday, there are, in a sense, maybe the more obvious documents to be drawn toward to be things like diary material, or where people keep kind of rich ego documents. But as we know, for the 16th and 17th centuries, that always leads you to at least the middle of society and above, and it's very hard to get beyond that to the kind of the more typical experience of being a husbandman in a rural area, or an alewife living in a rural area, which illiterate groups working in those kinds of contexts, and the kind of people who don't ever really leave their own records in a very direct way. And that's the group that I'm sort of most in, the groups that are hardest to recover are the ones I'm kind of most interested in finding out about for some reason.
So one of the ways that you've discussed doing that type of work is in a public domain through a blog that you run with two other colleagues, The Many-Headed Monster. And I loved when we first spoke about doing this conversation today, you mentioned this phrase, the virtual parish, which I absolutely love. And I wondered if you wanted to talk both about your experience of starting up and running a blog that deals with these questions of social history, and about where that might take us now and in the future.
Yeah, would you want to start with that one, because you're kind of founding member, aren't you? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the phrase "the virtual parish" was actually a riff on something that Andy Kesson said in the introductory video of the first bit lit video, where he was saying perhaps we need to try and find new forms of parish in the current circumstances, new forms of community, new ways of communing with each other and conversing and building that kind of those relationships in a digital way. So I thought that was a kind of interesting idea. And as we reflected on that, we were talking about the way that in many ways our blog was trying to create a virtual parish, but for a different set of reasons. that there were a number of other obstacles to perhaps the more traditional face-to-face academic community around the departmental seminar or meeting in the common room. Those things were kind of lost in the current environment. But when we started the blog, we were in many ways thinking about the obstacles were different, but the aim was the same. How do we keep conversations going when the physical infrastructure isn't quite doing that for us? So there were I think when the blog first started, initially it was myself and Brody Waddell, and then Laura and Jonathan Willis joined us, but we'd all been PhD students together at the University of Warwick at the same time. So at that point we'd had not so much a virtual parish as a kind of real academic parish where we were able to meet and discuss. We had a theory reading group that the postgraduates at Warwick used to be involved in. We had departmental seminars that we were engaged in. We also had what we call postgraduate forum, which was a kind of writing and feedback group for all the postgrads. So we got used to having these kinds of conversations as a postgraduate community, and then we all moved away. You finish your PhD and you get this kind of post-PhD dispersal where suddenly everybody leaves the parish and moves off all over the country. So that was the first kind of spur, if you like, saying, well, how do we try and keep talking to some of those people that we've been enjoying talking to? Now we're all at a distance. And whilst the blog was never just about talking to the other people involved in the blog, it was a way of having kind of conversations in a forum where we could still be talking to each other and a much wider group of people.
And on that, I mean, on a more kind of personal level, it has also encouraged us to remain in touch with each other, because when you're sending, the admin emails just saying, oh, I've got this in mind, or should we do this, or whatever it is, you're also just throwing in a bit of hope everything's okay, or how's your new baby, or what's happening now, So it kind of fulfills that sort of social function as well. Because of course the other thing that we had when we were at Warwick was a departmental staff room with a kettle and a fridge. So it seems like a kind of trite and trivial thing to say, but actually it's such an important space for just throwing people together, having a little kind of chat about whatever interesting thing that you found out about, might not end up writing about it or might never come up again, but you can just kind of share that, and it's all grist for the mill when you're doing this thing. So that kind of organicness of what we had at Warwick was something else that has also been sustained by having the blog. So very kind of interrupted.
I mean, one of the things that I really love about the blog and the sort of series that you sometimes do on it is you get a glimpse into, I guess, what we would probably term something like research in progress. So you're not only having and opening up these conversations with people, the core blog team and other people who might come in and guest write them, but you're also kind of teasing and trailing ideas aloud and giving, I guess, tidbits of your research on there. And I personally, as a reader and as someone who also does scholarly research, I find that really valuable and really helpful. And I don't know if you wanted to say something about how maintaining that kind of blog on a personal research level informs the way that you do work and the way that you kind of air it in public and shape it and work it.
Yeah, so this is something that we quite often end up talking about, kind of, how has this experience made a difference to what we do? And actually, a lot of the stuff that I blog about isn't necessarily what I would call work in progress, in that, again, I don't necessarily have plans to publish on it, but it's something that I've found which is really interesting, and there's something to say about it. But, a little blog post can be its kind of final destination. So it might well be a source that I'm teaching with, and I think, yeah, this would work really well, or something you've come across, when you're doing your teaching training, you write an interesting essay, and then what happens to it? Nothing, but you can reuse that content. So for me, I think it's less about kind of thinking through whatever research I'm doing at the time, although occasionally I do that as well. But I think the thing that's made the biggest difference to me is just thinking about my writing style. And as historians, that's actually quite unusual, or something that we don't necessarily think about or talk about very much. So obviously it's a very different way of writing. You've got a different audience in mind. You're being much more succinct. You're trying to, make it interesting and lively, and it's a much freer way of writing in many ways, and very enjoyable. So for me, I think it's been that kind of freeing me up a bit And I think that feeds then back into my academic writing, where I think a lot more carefully about what it is I'm doing and how I want to, like the kind of tone that I want to set, and where I might want to throw in something that's a bit more interesting or a bit more lively than what it used to be. So for me, I think it's actually it's less about content and more about the function of having done it and what that has kind of come back to academia, as it were.
I think that's kind of an unintended but very nice consequence of it, because I think probably when we first started doing it, you think of the blog as a kind of liberating space where you can, an idea that you think, well, is there an article in there? Could this go somewhere? Well, it doesn't really matter. I can just write a blog post on it. It doesn't go through peer review, and I can stick it out there and see if anyone finds it interesting. I don't have to craft it quite as carefully. You know, I'll try and make it more accessible and write it a bit more at pace and take on a different tone. So it was meant to be a chance to kind of do something slightly outside of the usual conventions, and you know, there's a lot of good reasons why we have a lot of the conventions and formalities that we do in academia, but sometimes it's nice to just to put an idea out there without having to kind of go through all of the, tick all of those boxes before you do so. So I think initially we thought it would just be a chance to do something that was completely separate from, or a little diversion from regular research. But actually, the more you write those blog posts, and you see actually it is quite an interesting way to spark a discussion, and you do get useful feedback on it, and it does help your writing style, and it allows you to reach a public and you know, a different group of scholars than you normally would. Then all of that does start to come back into how you do your normal research and writing. I think one of the other nice things with that has actually been the kind of question of audience is interesting, because you never really know we get lots of hits, but we don't really know who they are. So we often have these conversations of trying to kind of guess who's reading it. And I think I'm more optimistic than some people about how many non-academics read these blogs. But also one of the great things has been that people who are academics, often who are historians, but don't work on the same period, will read a short blog post. You might think, well, that research topic sounds interesting. They're much more likely to read 1,000 words on it than they are to read your 10,000 word article in your specialist journal that you publish. And then those people get in touch with you via Twitter or via the blog, and maybe you do end up then doing a real conference or a real workshop, including those people. So I think it's also really opened up lots of discussions beyond academia, but also with people within academia that you wouldn't necessarily speak to through more conventional channels.
I mean, on that question of, I guess its relationship with the research that you are doing, the more academic research, I hesitate to call it like that, but the more, I guess, traditional in the way you've put it. Would you like to talk a little bit about the types of work in progress that you have got going on that side of things?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm currently engaged in the follow-up to the women's work in rural England project, which also had a blog associated with it, where I've been working with Jane Whittle at the University of Exeter, and now we've got 2 postdocs on our project as well, Taylor O'Coin and Hannah Robb. And we're trying to, the idea is quite simple really. What we want to do is try and find out what work people were doing on a day-to-day basis, which is much easier to do for, well, so it's easy, but it's more straightforward in a sense to do for men than it is to do for women, because men are more likely to be paid a wage that survives in an account book, or to have an occupational title that survives in some census type data in the past. Whereas women's work is usually not waged, and women are not given occupational descriptors in any historical documents. So how do we find out what women's work actually entailed on a day-to-day basis? So what we've been doing is looking at witness statements from various court records, where witnesses are asked to say what they were doing at the time they witnessed a crime or a defamation, or witnessed a marriage contract being signed, and they simply give a little vignette of, I was on my way back from milking the cow, or I was picking cabbages in the garden when I saw somebody running out of the barn. And we've just been collecting, the idea is to collect 15,000 of these work activities through this method.
And this is around the early modern period, so we're thinking around 1500 to 1700, is that the sort of date span?
Yeah, yeah, that's the time period. And then what we hope to be able to do with all these individual instances is then ask some interesting questions about what patterns you find within that. The most obvious being, what's the gender division of labour? What jobs are done by men and what jobs are done by women, and get some sense of the proportion of how much, what percentage of agricultural work, for example, is done by men and what percentage is done by women. So these things are kind of intrinsically interesting in trying to kind of get a clearer sense of what everyday life actually looks like for ordinary people in rural England in the pre-industrial period. But it also can feed into lots of big debates about that economic historians are interested in, about how does the economy take off during the Industrial Revolution, how does it take off or start to take off prior to the Industrial Revolution. And lots of these models that economic historians rely on have struggled to integrate women. They're usually based on what are men doing as economic actors, and have very often not really been able to tell a story about how women's work feeds into these bigger economic processes. So we're hoping that what can seem like quite kind of quotidian everyday examples of people milking cows and carrying corn around on their heads can actually feed into some much bigger questions about how societies develop economically.
Great, and Mark's in the nice position where he can give a kind of really concrete answer to that question, whereas mine's a little bit more diffuse, because I'm just finishing up work on Ralph Thoresby, who is a late 17th and early 18th century diarist. He's a Puritan character. He's a dissenter who later conforms to the Church of England. He's based in Leeds, so he's a kind of provincial guy. And I've been working on his diary, which is huge. He writes it from when he's about 18 to when he's 65, just before he dies. Yeah, exactly. And it's very dense, and it mainly consists of sermon notes and, you know, him worrying about the fact that he's sinful and the kind of typical Puritan stuff. So I've been working on him, and I've kind of written what I'm now referring to as a suite of articles on Thoresby. And one of them was thinking just kind of about his personal devotional life, which obviously his diary gives a very clear and very structured insight into. I also came across some very fascinating material on a collection of ghost stories that he appeared to be collecting. So he was also an antiquarian and wrote the history of Leeds. And as part of that, he was quite evidently gathering information and stories from his local area and beyond that. So I wrote an article kind of thinking through that and looking at a case which he was actually personally involved with as well. So it's kind of interesting way that his research came together with his experience. And then I've got one final article that I'm kind of finishing up now, which is thinking about the way that, again, kind of thinking about those stories, but thinking about how they circulated in print, but then against some of his correspondence. So a lot of his correspondence survives as well. So looking at the different ways that that evidence was being passed around and shared, and what that might mean. And then, excitingly, I'm currently on research leave and working on a brand new project, which, in a way, I'm not quite ready to say too much about. But it's still kind of thinking about lives, which is something that when I was looking at the diaries and thinking about life writing, I was becoming very interested in lives and how people understood their lives. So it's going to be investigating that, and it's going to be thinking about how people frame their lives by looking at other models, and particularly looking in scripture for models. So when somebody like Ralph Thoresby or somebody else kind of is going through a particular experience in their life, do they reach for particular figures in scripture to help them to understand that? Or does it depend on gender, or does it depend on your age and your life cycle? So kind of looking at that question a bit and trying to tease out some of that. So I'm not going to say much more than that, but what I would say is one of the things I've been thinking about is how might I use the blog to think about research more. So if I am going to be writing a book about this, which I hope I will be, is there a way in which I can try and make the blog work that would help me to kind of fruitfully produce stuff and start those discussions there, but that it could also then feed more directly into the traditional academic side of what we're doing as well. So I haven't quite come to any conclusions yet, but I will be thinking about that.
That sounds great. Well, one of the questions, I guess, coming out from what you've both said there about the types of material that you're reading, one of the questions that we're asking all of our guests on here is about the term literature, or the word or the concept, however you want to take that, really, and what that means to you, or how you understand that. And you can answer that in any way you like, because of course it's a huge question. But I throw that over to you.
Okay. Yeah, we were wondering about this. We have been tipped off that this question would be coming, and as historians, we suddenly realised we probably didn't have as clear an answer to that question as maybe some guests on the BitLit might have had. I started thinking more about the literature that I consume sort of for pleasure rather than necessarily from a scholarly perspective. But then that led me back round to thinking that these things are more connected. So I mostly work on court records and have done recently, but have also looked at cheap print broadside ballads in particular in the past, and as a form of kind of popular literature. But I think I was thinking about the literature that I tend to read now for pleasure, and thinking about what does literature mean to me in that context. And a lot of it is about being able to inhabit subjectivities that are not your own, or trying to inhabit subjectivities that are not your own. And I guess a lot of the novels that I would read are about that kind of, somebody else's perspective, even on just everyday mundane aspects of existence, and the way that people react and feel differently and respond to different situations, and that literature can kind of take you outside of your own world. And there is a parallel there to what I'm interested in as a historian, which is trying to kind of get at, well, what did the world look like or feel like, and how was it experienced by somebody living in the 16th and 17th centuries? And I think it's the same sort of set of questions that lead me to find literature interesting. The term I was thinking about is it Raymond Williams, I think, who talks about literature as giving you kind of access to structures of feeling. And I think that's a kind of, as a social historian who's interested in stuff like structures, I quite, that term kind of worked quite nicely for me. That idea that reading literature can give you a sense of the structures of feeling. I mean, I think the quote the reading where I came across that quote, Williams was sort of talking about the structures of feeling of an age or of a period. I think that's maybe a bit grand. I'm not quite sure that any particular piece of literature can quite be that representative, but I think it can certainly give you insight into the structures of feeling of individuals, or maybe of wider groups in particular contexts. So I think that's a kind of, there's some of the thoughts I would have about what literature means to me and why I'm interested in it.
Interesting. I came at this from a completely different angle, which was I immediately just thought of sources and primary material that I work with. And as somebody who's interested in cultures, it tends to be that I'm often working across lots of different genres. And as a religious historian, obviously, I've got what's coming from the church, and then I've got the other stuff that's going on elsewhere. And quite often you're trying to think about the impact of one or the other, or the kind of integration or the conversation and dialogue that's happening between them. So for me, there's literary sources and then there's other sources. And I'm afraid to say that I do in some ways associate the literary sources with the kind of more fictionalized or perhaps entertaining side of things. And then it's theological treatises and sermons and catechisms and the stuff that kind of falls into the other category. So it's not, obviously that's a crude summary, but it's like, okay, I have these sources, and then when I want to think partly about dissemination and reach and impact, I might reach for a more literary side of things, but also when I'm thinking more about mentalities or worldviews, or trying to capture something kind of a bit bigger, then I might well be thinking about literature in those terms.
I mean, as you were talking, one of the things that struck me, or that I sort of remembered, is you have a piece on the Many-Headed Monster about, I guess, the intersections of those different elements, where you look at historical novels, or what we would now call a historical novel, which I guess is, some of them go for that kind of idea of what a structure of feeling might look like, or what it might mean to put potentially drier material into what we would now see as a more exciting narrative. Yeah, so I guess in that sense there are genres of writing where these two ideas converge and come together.
I think it's also, I mean, I've also written a post on The Monster about kind of the role of story in early modern history, and thinking about, so I'm interested in that question of how do historical novelists depict periods, and do they manage to capture the structure of feeling. It's one thing to be able to capture some of the materiality maybe of the past, or some of the kind of the nuts and bolts of what living in the past might have been like. But often where a historical novel falls down is where you just think, would they really have thought like that? Would they have said that? Would that have been their reaction to this particular context? And it is often those kind of structures of feeling where you think, I don't think they've quite got that right. But I still find that fruitful, because that sets you off on a series of questions. You think, well, if I don't think that's right, what do I think this character would have done? And that sends you back to kind of asking sort of research questions in a way. But I also wrote a piece about the role of story within academic writing, and the way historians tell stories in a way that's probably not as self-conscious and reflective as it should be. And I think probably literary scholars are more conscious of their own thinking about their own writing in terms of narrative and storytelling.
But in some ways that's a peculiarly early modern thing. So, coming back to my literary sources, I might, that doesn't just mean, I'm talking about a play. It means, I might be looking at a pamphlet, which is in theory a news report about a flood or an earthquake or whatever it is, also using really obvious what I think of as literary tropes or motifs or whatever it is. So it's that kind of blending, and there's no clear distinction between what is fictionalized and what is real, and how those things are mixing. So the way that the historian is also telling a story is kind of actually fits in with, and reflects back to us what our sources are doing often. So
I think it's also like when you write a blog post, you think you're trying to tell a story, and maybe there's a bit more of a template or a formula, but you think, which there is if you write an academic journal article, there is a kind of template or formula, especially within historical studies, I think, of what this article should look like in terms of the way the narrative will develop, or there's a series of templates you can kind of draw upon. But the blog is also, writing for the blog, you can think, well, hang on, I don't need to just use those templates. I can tell a story in a slightly different way. But also you're more conscious that this has got to be interesting and engaging in the way that an article isn't necessarily where you set out when you're writing an article. But then thinking about that process of how do I tell my research findings as an interesting narrative that's going to absorb a reader, something you do think about when you write a blog post, and then it makes those questions more present. So I think that's another way in which writing for the blog has started to feed back into becoming much more self-conscious about how to tell a story when you're doing more traditional forms of academic writing as well.
Oh, that's great, thank you. I mean, was there anything else you wanted to sort of bring up or raise in this conversation before we?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to reflect a little bit on forms of virtual parish, just coming back to that idea, and say we felt like in some ways a lot of the things that we were trying to do with the blog were similar to what you're trying to do with a bit lit now, and find ways of creating scholarly conversation and communication in an environment where the physical infrastructure isn't straightforward at the moment. And I think we felt like in some ways the blog allowed us to overcome some of those obstacles and to create conversations that stretched beyond geographical and physical boundaries. But we also thought, when we were talking about this before meeting with you, we were thinking, what didn't work so well? What did we think about the virtual parish we created through the Many-Headed Monster that didn't work so well? And I think one of the hardest things is to create dialogue. What we found with the blog is it's a good way of presenting ideas, and people might respond with if you get a series going, that can work quite well. Other people will write a blog post that kind of responds to the initial post. One thing we have seen is a huge drop off in the amount of comments that people will put on a blog post. But it used to be, you'd write a post in the expectation that you might get a dozen questions and comments as a form of feedback. Now that's much more unusual. doorbell ringing in the background. And now that's much more unusual, I think, to actually get commenters on blogs. A lot of the discussion takes place on Twitter, but it's all short format. It's more ephemeral. Often people will comment on your blog post and you don't realise, because if they don't at you and they're having a conversation somewhere on Twitter, that you can miss very easily. So I think that's one of the things that we're still puzzling over a little bit. And I think this video format is a really great way of having a dialogue and having a conversation with people. And I expect you've probably had a similar experience to us in that you get hits on the videos, so people are watching them, but you don't necessarily get how much of a dialogue that creates around a particular video. How many comments you get is much harder to gauge.
I wonder how much also that's the sort of history, a very compressed kind of history of the way that social media platforms have developed so quickly. And you were relatively early on, I guess, or to this blog activity as a major as a major contribution to kind of social history and discussion. Whereas now the blog is such a familiar tool, and there are I guess a number of them, that having that concentrated space for dialogue, I guess it becomes a little trickier. And that's where places perhaps like Twitter allows a more fluid discussion between the types of people who are on Twitter. And then, of course, there are the people who may well be reading your posts and reading your blogs, but aren't necessarily online in the same ways that some of us are. And I guess there's no easy answer to get around that dialogue. But
yeah, because that's one of the things that worry most about new forms of kind of virtual research communities, is that it's thinking about who doesn't get included, and in a sense being able to have conversations that I think the parallel between something like a virtual research conversation and something that happens at a conference, for example. So in a conference environment, you might sit at the back of a panel, watch people have a kind of discussion that maybe we're having here, but then there's an opportunity for you to, maybe in the coffee break, if you don't want to ask a question in front of a large room, there's a chance in the coffee break, maybe you can corner somebody from the panel, or even have a breakout conversation with somebody over coffee who is also sat at the back, where you get something really valuable and interesting out of that discussion. And I think, does Twitter provide an equivalent space for that kind of, the noise that happens around the blog post or the video conversation? It's the ripples that are, you don't really go, when you come away from a conference, it's often not the papers that you found really valuable. It's all the little conversations that have rippled out from the papers you've had over dinner and over drinks. And it's that I don't know how you replicate that so effectively in an online way. That there's a danger that we consume a blog post or we consume a video, and but we don't necessarily we haven't quite cracked yet how you then talk about and discuss it more informally with in a way that mirrors the over coffee chit chat that's quite informal. And I like that idea that this is the bitlit videos are supposed to be a bit like chatting in a coffee shop, and you're much more likely to say over coffee, "No, I didn't get that bit," or I was wondering if this relates to that. They're not the things you would necessarily put as a comment on a blog post, or even necessarily as a comment on Twitter, but you would share in a more informal environment. So I think there are challenges for us in thinking about some of the things that we lose in the virtual environment, and whether we can find ways of recreating some of those as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What should we wait for Laura to come back, or what?
I think she's just wrapping up with whoever's at the door.
Okay, that's cool. I'll wait, and then we can cut this. We can sort of cut this bit out so that we have a. But yeah. To pick on what you were just saying there, that kind of the impermanence of the throwaway conversation in a as you say, like a coffee break in the middle of a conference, I think is really valuable. And even on Twitter, you can't, as ephemeral as it might seem, there's something permanent about typing and pressing tweet. I think that
it's also public, isn't it? If you put a comment on Twitter, it's, you know, even if you're just talking, you're just aiming it at one other individual, and it's a response that's a few tweaks down a thread, you're still putting something out there that's public, and that other people reading that thread are going to see what you said, and sometimes that's a good thing. But there are, you know, how do you replicate that space where you can have serendipitous or informal conversations with people that you don't know? That's the other thing. It's very, you know, it'd be very possible for us to say, you know, for a virtual conference, you have a panel of papers where people give a short video and a Q&A, and then you could perhaps Skype video with some of your friends to comment on it, but you're just going to end up having those conversations with the people that you already know. Whereas the good thing about the real life environment is you can get into that kind of informal, non-public, non-recorded conversation, often with people who you don't really know, and that starts a new relationship, a new friendship, a new conversation. And that one of the things I worry with the kind of online format is it will allow us to continue having face-to-face conversations with the people that we already know, and it's those more kind of
getting outside the network to make new connections. And
and I think in a way, you know, even some like the blog or something like this might open up these conversations for other people to view and to see, but that's not the same as participating directly. And I think that's a much more difficult question to get around. Who was that?
Sorry.
That was actually Felicity Henderson.
Oh, no way. Well, there we go.
She lives just the next street up. So she just rang the doorbell to say hello.
Oh, how funny.
And she said, hello.
We'll pass my hello back to her when you next see her.
She was stood at a responsible distance.
She was stood on the pavement, and that's more than 2 meters away.
It was nearly a surprise guest. There we go. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking about these kind of ideas of the virtual parish, but also hearing about the work that you have in hand and the research that you're doing, and the ways that you're making that you're sharing that publicly. It's been great. So thank you so much for coming along.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us and inviting us. It's really nice, you know, and it's obviously really nice to connect at the moment as well. So it's great.
Great. Well, I look forward to speaking soon.
Yeah.
Great. Cheers, Cam.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.